and Noah Powers and Victor Madia excused. But we do in fact have a quorum, 3 required, and we have 4. The first item is the approval of minutes of May 14, 2015 regular meeting. Do I have a second?
Also move.
All in favor?
Aye.
All right. The June 9, 2015 Joint Utilities Commission / Finance Commission meeting. Approval of the minutes. Have a second?
Second.
In favor?
Aye.
Passes. That is not on the agenda, but with what's occurring in regard to our electric facility. We have the privilege of having Mr. Wright here. And, Chef, if you would give us whatever the latest and greatest breaking news is. Thank you.
Thank you. Glad to be here again. Just briefly, as I think you know, we met with the mayor and city manager, and I met with OUC's senior management 11 days ago, Thursday, July 30th. And we came out with basically an agreement in principle that provides some additional economic improvements in favor of the city, including starting a new arrangement October 1st, assuming that we can get all the details worked out. I will tell you I'm highly optimistic that we can get the details worked out. We may or may not be able to buy the full amount of the peaking capacity that they wanted to sell us effective October 1st, but we have an agreement in principle that we can still start the price reduction on the base product affected October 1st in any event, and we'll figure out exactly how to handle the peaking product. Transmission arrangements look promising at this point, but that's in the hands of transmission planners at OUC and FPL right now, and we'll see how that works out. Regardless, we should be in line to get a rate reduction October 1st. We are trying to figure out the details of how that might work, and there are 2 different discount rates. OUC's discount rate is 2.5% higher than ours, and that will influence what the actual numbers are. And we're trying to figure out how to best tilt the rates to provide either lower rates early or flatter rates over the next 5-6 years, something like that. And we're trying to figure that out, but we expect to have a further update by next Tuesday.
Any questions?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wright, is this new contract with OUC, is that going to completely substitute and replace the current existing contract? The one that goes, I think, 2029 and is
well, among other things, and in my view of the world, and a view held by a good number of folks, the new deal would only run through December 31st, 2029, not through December 31st, 2023, not through 2029. Technically, there's an open question as to whether it's going to be a single new document in the form of an amended and restated power purchase agreement or in the form of the existing agreement with amendments. I personally am more inclined to the former, a single document amended and restated, but that's something that my counterpart, Mr. Browder, and I need to work out yet. Did that answer your question?
Pretty close.
Okay.
Will it have a $50 million penalty like the existing one does? The same.
I don't know the answer to that.
All right, so we're still in the negotiating stage then to some extent.
Yeah, it will be an 8-year deal, not a 15-year deal.
Okay.
And that has a lot of benefits.
Yes, sir.
Question? Just invite any public comment on Mr. Wright's presentation. Mark?
Sorry. Mark Mucher, 617 Indian Lilac Road. Just a quick question. I think I know what the answer is, but this is for Jim and Chef. I believe one or more papers reported that they signed the deal subject to council's approval on Tuesday. And so I just want to confirm that that's not the case, because Chef told me before the meeting there was no contract. So I don't know whether it was a letter of intent or this is just made up by the press out of whole cloth. So I'm curious as to where that came from.
Going to get your answer.
We have signed absolutely nothing because there is nothing to sign.
Thank you very much. The process, when and if it's signed, is we have a joint utilities finance commission scheduled for later this month. I was wondering whether that would play into a review of the material or not.
Mr. Chairman, it depends on where we are in the process at that time. If this is one of those areas that we've got to get down to the details and work out the numbers and be very comfortable ourselves before we would recommend something to either you all or to the City Council. So we haven't worked out that process yet.
Okay, thank you. My point is that we may have to be rescheduled or otherwise addressed, just FYI, and I think that the Utilities Commission, based upon what Chef just said and your reporting, perhaps, Sherry, you could send a message, a summary to the Utilities Commission regarding the joint meeting. Thank you.
Yes. One of the key factors here is in order to get this effective October the 1st, and one of the little challenges that we've had in the process, I think way back when we were offered the November provision, if you would have taken the discounts over that period of time, it would have represented a considerable amount of dollars. And so we have a way of procrastinating. And we have tried to set this October the 1st date. If we set that date, we need to be ready to make a decision, yes or no. And it's just because OUC doesn't mind charging us the rates that we have. And so it's no skin off their teeth, but at the same time, it's costing our ratepayers. And we seem to have a tendency to incur those costs. So just to put that as a part of the discussion.
And my follow-up question is, assuming this gets signed and approved by the 1st, how swiftly can the changes be, whatever they are, be implemented?
Well, that's a good question because, for example, in the transmission study, there are issues, for example, capacitors at substations. Are those capacitors in inventory somewhere where we can get a hold of them? If the re-rating of transformers has to be done, how quickly can we do that and get that submitted? If there's any type of construction that has to be done, now the city has to pay if we expedite that. Most everything that has been uncovered to this point has been in the planning stages of Florida Power and Light, so we have to just pay the expedited cost of that incurring if that has to be done. So that will have a time frame involved in it. And then as Chef said, what we're trying to do is get a deal that we get advantage of the best rates as soon as possible, even if some of those conditions can't be met and we have to rely, for example, on Unit 5. And so those are the type of details that have to be worked out. But our hope would be is that we would have those rates in effect October the 1st. It would come in our November billing and would go out to our customers after we have that bill.
All right. Well, thank you. I just didn't want to have, once dates are mentioned, people think that it's instantaneously, and just some caution in regard to when the rates will actually be implemented.
If anyone's followed this saga, they know nothing is instantaneous.
And that's the reason I brought it up.
Yeah. So please, yes, we try to set dates, we try to set goals in order to make it happen. And again, if you look at our history, we've oftentimes don't do those. So,
Thank you. Questions? The next agenda item is Chairman Matters. I'm going to withhold my discussion of our charge. We've been tasked with looking at the budget, and Cindy's going to present that in terms of what could be done potentially to reduce the taxes. And I will address that when we get into after Cindy's presentations. I want to clear the other items we have on the agenda before we get to the issue of attempting to reduce the taxes. So Cindy, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll try to keep these other two items brief, as there really isn't that much, I guess, to be said about them. The first one is the third quarterly variance report and our financial report and variance analysis. You all should have received our quarterly report and then an analysis of those variances that meet our criteria, which is if they are more or less than 10% over or under the pro rata year-to-date of 75%, and whether the line item itself also has an amount in excess of $70,000, so that we don't analyze really tiny variances. Bottom line, there's really not much that I see here within this report that makes me think we'll have be too far off budget, particularly in the general fund at the end of the year. I did want to note just a couple of things real quickly, because I think they might be useful to our discussion about the proposed budget for next year. The first one is on page 26. You'll see that at this point, year to date, we are running, I'm sorry, not 26. We want to go back to, excuse me for a second. Back to page 17, 18. At the top, you'll see that operating salaries year-to-date in the general fund are at 69.7% of the budgeted amount, and we're at 75% of the year. But I wouldn't want that to lead you to think that we're running behind budget on salaries. The way it works, and we've talked about this before, is first of all, there's 26 payrolls in a year, and they're not evenly distributed. So in the the last quarter of this fiscal year, there are actually 7 pay periods, not 6. On top of it, the first paycheck in October, whatever portion of it is appropriate, actually gets accrued back or charged back to the prior fiscal year. And it just so happens that the first paycheck in October has a payroll date of October the 9th and is paid through October the 2nd, and therefore 80% of that will actually be charged back or accrued back to the prior fiscal year. So if you look at 7.8 payrolls remaining in the last quarter, divided by the 26 we have every year, that is 30% of the payroll costs. And so any fund like this one or any other fund that is running right at 70% of payroll against budget at this point in the year is right on target to be at the overall number at the end of the year. So I just said that since that's a huge cost in every fund, I didn't want anyone to get the impression we were making up 5% on payroll, because we're not at this point. If you look at page 26 now, I did also want to point out that I do not have page numbers right today. Sorry about that. Page 32, where we have the electric utility consolidated balance sheet. We've been monitoring this for the last 3 quarters, and you'll notice there at the bottom, at this point, we have about 84 days of unrestricted cash on hand in our electric utility, with our goal being somewhere in the neighborhood of 90. So we're hoping to bring that up to the goal by the end of the year.
And excuse me, at the end of the year, what's your target at this point, Cindy?
Our target is always 90. The summer tends to be higher revenue, and it's not the months where we pay debt service, so summer tends to accumulate a little bit more. That kind of leads into our discussion about the third quarter utility rate sufficiency, but I'm thinking we'll probably be up to 86 or so, depending on how the summer goes and the rate decisions we make. Moving towards 90. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions you have about specific variance items, but, again, I don't see anything particularly alarming in the analysis or in one direction or the other. Any questions or comments? If not, moving on. Okay. The next thing that you have on your agenda is the third quarter electric utility rate sufficiency. And as you know, last quarter we were showing, if you look at the second page of this, is probably the good place to look. At that bottom line, we were showing a forecasted surplus of about $900,000, right around 1% of revenues. And again, as we've talked about in the past, we feel like that's a pretty comfortable margin. That's not much margin for changes and variances in sales and costs. However, if you look at the third quarter rate sufficiency, which contains actual expenditures and actual sales and billed revenue through June, we're now showing that year-end surplus climbing to just over $2 million. Essentially, what's happened is, as we all know, it's been very, very hot. And so if you look at the third chart here where it's represented graphically, we have had sales and billed revenue forecasts coming in above our, or actuals coming in above our original forecast, while at the same time, our purchase power costs have been running at, or even in some cases under, our original forecast. And so as a result, we're looking at something more in the neighborhood of $2 million through end of third quarter. Looking at that and kind of examining where that leads us into the future and working with our rate consultant, PRMG, we are recommending at this time that we make a $1.85 decrease on the bulk power cost charge, which would be about a 1.5% decrease on your typical 1,000 kilowatt hour residential bill. As we're talking about this, we're also, in the context of what Mr. Wright said, talking about other potential rate reductions come October the 1st that would be contingent on optimization and restructuring the contracts, et cetera. But we feel comfortable at this time, at least, that we could do $1.85 towards that longer-term goal. And that would be effective depending on your recommendation, the Utility Commission's recommendation, and then ultimately this would go to Council on the same agenda where they would be discussing these other issues for October the 1st, and that at time would be their decision as to whether they want to do this part now and something else later, or perhaps combine it all together.
Questions? So, what are you talking? You're talking a dollar increase on $1.85? You said on what?
$1.85 decrease.
Decrease
on
the purchase power cost, which is running lower than our original estimates.
Well, how does that translate into an average bill?
1.5%.
All right. So, and 1.5% of what number are we using? 126?
123.43, I believe, is where it is right now.
Isn't it safe to say $1 to $2 a month savings on a bill?
$1.85. If you're a 1,000 kilowatt hour customer, it would be $1.85.
Okay. Right.
So 1.5%.
And particularly for our business customers, that percent obviously is based upon the usage is generally higher. So my perspective is anything we can do as soon as we can do, go ahead. Not a wait until what Chef's working on, but incorporate that into
absolutely. That's what we should do.
The change. Because frankly, I'm not overly optimistic that all of the other contracts, as we discussed before, can be implemented by October 1st, which is after, it has to be vetted by everyone. So my recommendation is to go forward with the reduction.
I agree with that. So,
is that a second?
That's a second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you. We'll review this with the Utility Commission tomorrow, and then, as I said, the Council on the 18th of August. So now on to the big topic. I'd like, if I could, to just sort of set the stage for your conversation, because there's a lot of information that came at you. You've got the operating budget, which is about that thick. You've got the capital projects budget, which has all the backup sheets for the individual projects. And so I wanted to recap what happened at the workshop and kind of what that means to the general fund, which is clearly the biggest topic of conversation because that's the one that affects the tax rate and is not funded like the enterprise funds are through its own resources and revenues. So essentially, what I have given you is a recap, if you will, of the increases in the general fund, and I want to walk down through them between what we proposed for 15-16 and what the council tentatively approved, and what we had in the adopted 14-15 budget. And as we walk down through these, keep in mind that the bottom line is that council adopted a not-to-exceed millage rate that is 2.6437, which is about a 38% increase over the rolled back rate. And the effect of that increased tax rate, along with our increased valuation for property, generated another $1.7 million. And so what I want to show you is essentially what that $1.7 million went towards, which I think will help facilitate your discussion about A, what are the budget priorities, and are these things worth funding with a tax increase, or B, other things that you think might be more important that were maybe not considered. So again, down at the bottom you see the 1.7, a little over 1.7 increase in ad valorem tax revenue. Let's go back to the top. The first change that's in the budget, and if you look at the way I've laid this out, each of these numbers on the far right includes not only salaries but any associated personnel costs like Social Security, general employee pension impacts, etc. So these numbers on the far right are all in, if you will. They're the total cost at the bottom line of each of the things that we've proposed in the budget. The first is a 3% pay increase for existing employees. Again, these are only general fund impacts. That would be about $347,000 to the general fund. The second thing is a pension cost increase that came about as a result of our new defined contribution plan of about $183,000. That's just straight up with no adjustments to any other salaries, without the 3% increase. This is the amount that the cost of the pension plan went up because, as we all know, we still have to make our unfunded liability payment towards the defined benefit plan, and that remained essentially flat. But the normal contribution to the defined benefit plan was running about 4%, and the new contribution to the city's defined contribution plan is 9%. Now, this is not the whole 5% because when we adopted the 14-15 budget, we knew that the DB plan, DC plan change was coming. And so we did already in our 14-15 budget adopt for 3/4 of the year at that DC plan. So the full impact didn't hit us in this year because we had already budgeted part of this switchover in last year. But anyway, at the bottom line, that switch is $183,000 out of the new budget, the monies that were being funded by ad valorem taxes. We had a rise in health insurance costs for the existing employees of a little over $100,000, which is actually extremely good news. I think when we first spoke of this, we thought the increase was going to be around 15%, and it ended up coming in at 4%. So that's not too bad of a number. We also have some proposed new positions for the budget, and essentially those boil down to 2 new police officers full-time, the one admin bookkeeper in my department, another person in IT, and a couple of new lifeguards, full-time lifeguards. And we can go through the specific positions in a minute, but that all in costs us about $346,000. Next thing.
Can I just make a quick comment on that?
Sure.
If you look at the personnel cost alone, it's $346 on line 1. On the health insurance cost, it's another $100,000, and for new employees, it's $346. So it's about $800,000 increase in the budget is personnel cost. Now,
I did it the same way as Cindy.
What are those figures again? I'm sorry. Could you repeat that? How much?
I think he's referring to the figures that are on this page.
On the sheet, it's
What did you calculate, though? That's what I'm asking.
And actually, there are a couple of more. The risk management one is personnel costs as well. So until we get down to the other miscellaneous personnel changes, that first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 changes are all personnel costs and part-time salaries below that as well.
I did it the same way you did, Cindy. I didn't break it out. And I added it all up. And, it came up that we had picked up through new staff and all the payroll benefits and the whole thing, $1.1 million. The time it's all said and done, which was totally about 6.6 over net last year. That
right.
was just right at $1.1 million. And I didn't break it out. I totaled it up right off the financial statements.
Right.
And it came to $1.108, which is 6.6 over our previous year's budget. Right. When you add it all up, the new staff, et cetera.
Now, one of them, and I did this a couple of ways. If you look, see that little partial line that's a little ways down there? That actually sums up how much of what you're talking about, how much is salaries, Social Security, pension, health insurance, et cetera. So I kind of put it in a box so you could look at it different ways and see exactly which elements of it. But for instance, health insurance costs for employees, that's not additional staffing or anything.
No.
That's right. It's just a rise in health
insurance.
It
is what it is.
So they're all kind of there. The last one, though, that I think is causing a little confusion, that is a personnel cost, is moving risk management into the general fund. As you know, for years, we were self-insured, and we actually had a risk management fund that paid for all of the claims for general liability claims and workers' comp, et cetera. And each fund, based on its proportionate share of the prior year's claims, essentially a premium, put money into that risk management fund every year. Well, a few years back, we decided to become fully insured. And at that point, we had a fairly substantial balance in the risk management fund. And so each of the other funds was able to stop putting money into the risk management fund. Well, a couple of years, and start paying their own premiums directly for the costs of full insurance. A couple of years have gone by. We've closed or paid down many of the outstanding legacy claims. But now we're to the point, but we continued to fund risk management personnel out of the risk management fund because it had a reserve. Now we're to the point where all that's left in the risk management fund is enough reserves to cover the very small number of outstanding legacy claims. And we can't continue to fund these personnel out of risk management. Essentially, each fund enjoyed a little holiday, if you will, because of the built-up balance, almost a return of premium, from having to put money into the risk management fund. Well, that's over. And so the two choices are to either have the funds all start putting money back into the risk management fund, which doesn't make any sense. We want to close it out and make it go away.
So
or put the personnel costs back into the general fund and allocate them to everyone else as appropriate.
Is that what caused it?
Excuse me. Are you saying after this year we're not going to have a risk management fund? It's all going to be part of the general fund?
It's all fully insured. And all that, we'll still have one, but all that's left in there are a very small handful of what we call legacy claims, things where we were self-insured and we're holding a reserve as those get paid out. But what we did about 2 years ago was we went away from self-insurance and we started purchasing insurance from various insurers, and each fund pays its own share of those premiums, and we no longer insure ourselves, have a self-insured fund. So that risk management fund's just hanging around till we get rid of those last handful of legacy claims.
Okay.
That's what caused the $125,000 increase in personnel funds costs.
It's a net.
Yeah.
It's $282,000 to move risk management into the general fund, but it's $160,000 extra in admin costs back out to the other funds, because every fund still has to pay its share of these people. I mean, these people manage workers' comp claims, and there's no work to do just because we don't self-insure. We still have to. We have a fairly large staff, then we still have to do the things that get us good premiums, like safety, committees and things like that. But it's just it's a little bit of a shift that unfortunately had to happen this year in the middle of all the rest of this going on. So that's not really optional, but the net to the general fund is $282 minus the extra revenues.
If the millage rate stayed the same, do you know how much additional revenue the city would get from an increase in valuation? The valuation went up 7%, 7.6.
About 7.8.
Do you know how much that alone would generate in extra revenue?
If we had essentially stayed with the prior year's millage rate, it would be a little over an extra $300,000 in revenue, about $330,000. $330,000.
$330,000. Okay.
That's essentially how much this year's property value would generate at last year's tax rate.
I just, and you and I have talked about this, Cindy, and you can weigh in, is that right now, if you go on the website for jobs in the city of Vero Beach, there are 7 openings granted 5 of them are in recreation and at lower entry levels. But there's one for a police officer and another one for a call handler. Now, so that's 7. Next year, there are 8, which are 2 in the PD, police department, 3 in rec, 2 in finance, and of course the 2 aforementioned that are coming from the risk management. Well, what it means is that you can't release next year's until October 1st. For example, the chief tells me that for police hires, and the police hires go through background checks, and it takes up to 2 months on a new officer to do background checks, somewhat less for the call handlers. Now, add to that what happens during the year when there are losses, resignations, retirements, and so everyone is budgeted for a full year. And to the degree that they are not filled, there is some lag, and that lag ends up essentially with a purpose. And what you're really saying is it's deferred maintenance or delay of services because you're not putting that workforce on. But that's just a comment in terms of what happens because we haven't been adding people through the years. And so with the number that we are, I think that might, for the following year, provide somewhat of a cushion other than what was in the original budget. But that's just a comment. You can't bank on that because obviously until it happens, you have to go with what the budget is. And then reality, that's why Cindy does the analysis, the variance analysis, as we track it through the year. So just a comment.
So, and that certainly is the case. And a lot of times what happens is the turnover gets overcome by, if you will, by the payout of sick and vacation, which fills in the gap for the weeks that we don't hire a person. But let's just go down through a couple more things here that I think are really critical to the budget, and then I will turn it over to you to start discussing what you think is appropriate. The next thing you see on here is something that we've not that I can see ever done before, and that is for the first year we're budgeting to make a fairly substantial transfer of money from the city's general operating fund into the capital construction fund to fund more infrastructure projects, street paving, and recreation primarily.
Is that the $450,000?
That's the $450,000. So, what you'll see is this money is transferred to 304, and then we can talk within 304 about the increased level of projects that it's designated for. But essentially, for the first time, we're taking not just our operating costs and paying them with revenue, but we're taking ad valorem taxes, which we're allowed to do because they're available for any lawful purpose, and we're transferring them to our capital construction fund to meet some of our shortfall and needs for recreation facilities that are falling apart, road paving that's behind what would be a normal replacement schedule. So that's a fairly big number of the $1.7 million, and certainly has been the topic of some discussion among council. The next thing that we're doing for kind of the first time in a long time, but not the first time ever, is transferring a little bit of money to the cemetery. Right now, we're doing everything we can to price columbarium appropriately, et cetera. But that's one of those things. The demand is what it is, and if revenues are lagging behind, we can't really run a deficit. So we're proposing to make a small transfer to support the cemetery a little bit. Another very small number, $42,000. That's the end of our repayment to the FEMA Department of Emergency Management debacle, and we're hoping someday that money will come back to us, but we're not going to hold our breath for FEMA to figure that out. And then finally, we have about $76,000 in general fund operating capital expenditures, things that can't be paid out of 1 cent sales tax because they don't really meet the requirements for infrastructure, small things, computers, sort of almost consumable capital expenditures. And then below there, you have what I call miscellaneous. These are if you add them all up and down, they're minimal. They're just the little things that happen from year to year. Workers' comp goes up, the pension valuations go up and down a little. The retiree premium assistance went down, that sort of thing. Taken all as a whole, those are almost net zero. And some of this gets supported by a small amount of net revenue increases, but I didn't want to get carried away with those because they're kind of all puts and takes. They're 150 grand. So bottom line, the bulk of this is being supported by the proposed increase in ad valorem tax revenue. I mean, the other funds, the electric utility fund was budgeted based on the base case scenario that we're currently working under. The water and sewer fund continues to show good reserves and revenues over expenses and good money available for some of the capital projects that are on. The airport fund looks good. I know you've kind of run through the recap of all the rest of them, and so certainly we could talk about those. But really, I think a lot of the focus, at least in our budget workshops, was on this fund, the general fund, and now the general capital fund, because now the two are related. I did provide this caution in the budget workshop. Now that we've started to flow money toward 304, that's fine, but understand it can't flow back in the other direction. The 1 cent sales tax is very restrictive and is restricted for infrastructure projects in a pretty narrow definition. So there's nothing you can do in Fund 304 or 311 to provide relief that will help operating costs. It can only really go in the other direction, and so keep that in mind as we walk through this as well. And then finally, this budget does not include any provision for the funding of OPEB, as you had initially recommended. We had a pretty long conversation about this at the budget workshop, and I have spoken with our actuary, and the issue really is that, first of all, it's another $354,000 to the general fund, as you know, at the 17-year level that you recommended. And the actuary basically said that you're not really in a position to partially fund it because establishing a trust fund is something you either do it or you don't. If you establish a trust fund and then begin to not make your annual required contribution to it from the standpoint of your books and your auditors, you're likely to end up worse off than you are right now, where you don't have a trust fund and you do pay as you go. It's one of those things that if we do it, we need to do it and then move forward to fund it every year and treat it as a commitment, not sort of put one foot on the platform and one on the train. It might actually cause a change in the discount rate. It might cause a negative comment if you establish a trust and then fail to fully fund that trust. And so they had kind of indicated that partial funding, probably not a great idea. Either fund it or maybe wait one more year. But once you begin to fund it, treat it as a commitment, fund it in its entirety, and fund it going forward. So at this point, given the other pressures on the budget, we did not include that $354,000. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
If I may, the issue of even though there's anticipated reductions in revenues next year with some of the initiatives that are underway, that until those initiatives are implemented, your estimate of the revenues, of which 6% is going to be taken to be transferred to the general fund, is going to remain with whatever your original estimate of revenues are going to be for next year.
Yes, that's the intention. As we've talked about before, once we establish a budget, which we do in the summertime in the absence of final data from FMPA or anyone else, we establish a transfer. We don't true that up to actual revenues on an annual basis. And so as a result, over the years, sometimes it's been a little, it comes close, but we've never trued that up. The proposal here is that what we budgeted for is, quote unquote, the base case. It's what's on the ground right now in terms of contracts, personnel, et cetera. In the absence of actually having these contracts signed and or, as you pointed out, or I think as the manager pointed out, even if we just undertake to shut down the plant on October the 1st, there's a period of time during which we have to continue to support employees and various things. It's not just October the 1st, all those costs go away. We're proposing to keep that base case budget as our bottom line, since we can only establish that budget once a year, and then certainly anything that transpires through the course of the year, it's council's prerogative to amend the rates as they go. This is just a little different situation than it always has been. Establishing a budget, bottom line, for this electric utility doesn't preclude any rate changes whatsoever. Any rate changes that are necessary can be made. This is an enterprise fund, and it is self-supporting through revenues, and it can be modified at any point during the year. What won't change is the transfer to the general fund, because that can only be set really once a year.
And there are potential exit costs, personnel exit costs that are not included in the budget, depending upon what occurs next year. So I'm very comfortable with whatever you're stating, as you've done in the past, what a true estimate is of what we now know will be information you have on hand, next year's revenues. Anything that is subsequent to that, as you said, can be dealt with by the council.
I'm going to speak to this again. I've done it the same way as you have, without the detail in it. And when it comes down to it, the fact is, the way I looked at it, we picked up about $1.7 million in tax increases. We picked up another roughly $270,000 in administrative costs, and we reduced our transfers back by about $165,000. So we had about $1,850,000 to work with. And of that amount, we used roughly $1.1 million for payroll and all the related costs of running our personnel situation. And we had roughly another $568,000 in capital expenditures. By the time you combine the $450 with others, we're about $100. So that left about $178 to spread over all the other operating costs within the general fund, outside of payroll, about $178,000, which turned out to be roughly around 3% of that cost, which is a really tight budget. Now, I continue to stress the point that there will never be an opportunity, a time, when any politician will vote for controlling the cost at some point. I mean, it's hard for me to see how sustainable this is. If you say, rough figures, that our tax revenue is going to go up by 3% a year, you just gave us $300,000. And that's $300,000 on roughly $5 million. Let's just say that you're going to get that. And yet our payrolls will go up on the $17 million we're spending on payrolls. I mean, they're going to escalate at 6 to 7%. Where's the gap going to get covered? Now, people stand here and tell me it's going to be in the utilities. Well, we're under pressure to reduce the utilities. I see no effort here to control other things we can control. This city has got about, at best, a $20 million budget, and if you looked at it outside of the transfers, it's a $13 million budget. And out of that 13, we spend discretionary expenditures, $2 million in recreation. That's not keeping the parks up. That's recreation for what my colleague says is a home deal of 14,000 homes. And if you say, okay, we got 3 people to a home, we got 45,000 people, and we're spending $2 million. Now, the question is, can we continue to do this? How do we continue to sustain the city if we've got a $5 million revenue source in taxes? Where's the gap going to get closed? Where are these buildings going? How are we going to maintain these buildings with that small a tax base? And how are we going to sustain it if, in fact, we're under pressure to reduce our utility bills? And at some point, we're probably going to reduce the gap. Our $5 million transfer is going to be $4 million or $4.5 million.
Glenn, if I could just interject, the only way I could see anyone answering your question is that the council is going to somehow just every year increase the millage rate.
Yeah, but they can't raise the millage rate that much, Dan. They can't.
I think 10 is the maximum, isn't it? I mean, the way they're going, they'll get there eventually. I'm answering your question, and I'm not, that's the only way they can make up the gap. You can only get so much from increased valuation. I agree with it. You're going to have some good appreciation. You're a realtor, but the real estate values, the appraised values, will go up a little bit every year.
Yeah,
but that won't make up the gap.
That's what I'm afraid of, and we have added to the cost. And again, I'm not being hard on our staff. I'm being a little hard on our elected officials, and we got a couple here. And I'm asking you, what analysis has been done? How good is our railroad, our building downtown? If we got 42 trains coming through here a day, can that building be maintained? How much vibration is it going to take? How much of the money we spent this year, what does it do? Paint it? Does it extend the life of the building? 5 years? 3 years? 1 year? What does it do? Or are we just doing cosmetic work? There's some questions here that I don't see being answered very well, and I'm looking at a couple of our city council members and saying, how do we sustain it? Where do the numbers come from? Additionally, when I look at the budget, we're throwing in another item. We're talking about the sewer situation here, and that's a pass-through to the taxpayers of roughly $1.3 million over the next couple of years. And yet I don't see where we got sustainability here.
Mr. Chairman, I think Mr. Old wants to enlighten us a little bit. If I may.
Randy Old, 935 Seagrape. I think those are all good questions, and I don't have a specific answer about what the vibrations of the train will do with building maintenance. I really just don't know. But I see that our income over the next number of years is going to be flat unless we do something. Our population is basically static. We're built out, and so we have to do a lot of planning. And we have to be able to look ahead over a number of years and decide how we're going to do this. Because it's a big issue. There's no question about that. And I don't see where it can come from other than tax increases. If we do a large tax increase this year like we were talking about, that should sustain us for a long period of time. But again, I haven't looked far enough ahead to really know. And this is something we haven't done before. We've been under pressure to cut and cut and cut and cut over the number of years, and we're good at that. But now we're down at the bottom, and now we have to look at it differently. We have to look ahead, and we haven't done that yet.
But we haven't done it, but we are locking ourselves into contractual liabilities that we can't reverse. I mean, our payroll increases are going on.
Yes.
We can't change. That's not changeable. And
it is changeable.
It's minorly changeable.
Yeah.
We both know it. It's minor.
Yeah.
And we are putting off, as Congress does in Washington, we are putting off how we handle liabilities. We don't admit that we've added $15 million to our balance sheet liabilities in the last 6 years. We're going to add another $2.5 million by the end of this year. $18 million on our balance sheet. Correct?
This is the OPEB, you mean?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Correct. And no plans for handling it.
Well, it's always been there. It's just not been recorded.
Absolutely. And that's one of the problems we got.
That's right.
And it's not just us. Other cities are the same boat.
Yeah.
We've got it, and it's getting bigger. And I don't see any plans. And I don't mean to be critical, but when we have elected officials on every 2-year cycle, they have a limited horizon. Usually they got a year to grow into the job, and maybe good decisions for 6 or 8 months, and then they'll run it again. We don't have a long enough time horizon in their minds to help the city.
I think that's a whole other issue.
I know it is, right?
Obviously, but I think that's part of it. There's an awful lot to learn and an awful lot to work on when you become a new member, and these are tricky problems. They're not something that once you get exposed to, you know the answer to it. But it's hard.
Again, Randy, I don't disagree with you, but we all know there are some things in our budget that are flat discretionary, and we won't attack the political problems. And that is $2 million in our recreation fund. Now, I know that's politically powerful, but somebody at some point is going to have to address some questions here.
Well, I think looking at each one of the areas that we have, recreation, marina, utilities, water and sewer, all of them have to be looked at, and we have to say, okay, what do we want to be to everybody? What can we be to everybody? Should somebody else be doing this, not us as a city? And we've not looked at that. We've not taken a close look at things like that.
But as long as, it's hard for us to fight about the marina when it's actually contributing cash flow to the entity.
Yeah.
So we can't kick it. We're not going to kick that. We have to look at those things that don't contribute. Now, I know I'll hear that, recreation contributes something, and it does. But does it come close to contributing $2 million in expenditures a year?
No, not close.
Well, I don't think so.
No, but
if you asked the homeowners, pick the homeowners, and said,
and should we be doing it? That's a very good question. I think the city asks itself, but I think the city asks itself more than the council does, or more than the commissions do, to say, okay, what do you think we ought to be doing? Because we look ahead and you say this is not sustainable, and we have to figure that out, and we haven't undertaken that. I asked a strategic planning person to come the last meeting we had, and I think that whole idea of doing a strategic plan going forward and which areas we really want to be in and which areas we don't, I think is a very important thing that we haven't undertaken.
Okay, I got a question now. You say we haven't done that. We haven't undertaken that, or we haven't done the strategic planning.
Yeah.
You say we should do that. We haven't done it, but we should do it.
Yeah.
Okay, then why raise the millage rate now before you've done the strategic planning, before you've looked at all these other factors? Why are you going for a millage increase now?
Well, we haven't voted on anything yet.
Okay.
What we've done is we've set a maximum.
Here's why I asked the question here.
Yeah.
Because I have a different take on this budget increase and the summary of increases in general fund. And this is a very organized one-page piece of paper. I'm glad you gave it to us. I look at this piece of paper. I think we can all agree that there's an increase from the prior year of $1.854 million, right? That's what it says there, at least on my page. And I look at all these items that it's going for. About 75% of it is in full-time salaries and associated benefits.
Sure.
And one of the reasons, or at least what I heard in the cliches in the media and from some of the council members, well, we just have antiquated equipment. Our computers are out of date. Well, our infrastructure is all shot. This budget increase doesn't account for any of that. It's 75% for the employees. There's very little that benefits the general resident, resident of Vero Beach.
Well, in all the other budgets, if you go through the capital budget, you'll see a lot for software, a lot for new computers, a lot for new software, a lot for that sort of thing, a lot for the roads that are not in there.
All I see here, Mr. Old, is $450,000.
Yep, and that's already on top of what already goes over there, which is $1 million.
But you see, you could get 75% of that, just the 330,000 you indicated, just from increased valuation without going into a millage increase.
Yep.
How much of the
the process was we sat down and we went through all the ideas of what the city is saying we ought to increase, what really is necessary, and we said, okay, then the maximum would be 30% increase to handle those things. And now it's a matter of getting into all the detail and trying to figure out what comes next.
See, Randy, I would have had a little more respect for this budget if I thought we had a little more respect for our liabilities. And just like we do in our homes, all of us budget for our families, and all of us budget the liabilities, and we get them covered. And then whatever's left, wife can spend, but until we cover those dang liabilities, she don't spend a damn dime, excuse my language. Now, to some extent, if we'd have put that in front and said, okay, this is what we got to work with after we begin to meet our liabilities, I can have a little more sympathy for it. Mm-hmm. But we've just done exactly what Congress is doing in Washington, pushed the liabilities to the next generation, and hoped. You're giving me hope. That's not a plan.
Well,
You're giving me hope that we're going to raise revenue enough to sustain it, and I don't see how we do it.
Well, what the council has not done before, is come to grips with the whole idea of the pension going forward. We've now addressed the pension, and we've got a lot of that paid for, and a lot of the health care and stuff, a lot of the pension terms changed, and that's a brand new thing. We've also now decided to set up this OPEB trust, and that's a brand new thing. And those are the things we're addressing. We don't have the ability to pay those off first. We just don't come close to it. So if you want to see Vero not be like Vero, we could address all those things first. But that's $14 million plus another $20 million or something, $35 million. We can't possibly pay that off before we increase expenses.
Nobody thought we could, Randy. Yeah. Nobody thought we could. Nobody would even think that way. But we have to begin to plan that way because, again, I've looked at the pension funds too, and we've had 3 to 4, 5 good years in the stock market. We've done exceedingly well in the stock market. Yeah. And it's been done propped up by our federal government reserve again. Now, when those guys start ratcheting the other way, do we really think a 7.25% pension fund return is going to be sustainable? Buffett doesn't. Yeah. The guys that are really knowledgeable, they don't, because they think there could be a downturn. So, yeah, we got our pension funds covered today. We're in the 85% bracket. But if something goes haywire in the stock market, that 85 could dissipate quick.
Right. I understand. Yes.
And our gap is going to get bigger, So.
Just as a comment, though, when we froze the plan, we were required to lower the discount rate. Right. So that was part of the freeze. We went down to like 6.5.
We got to get down.
We're going the right. We're at 6.5.
We're down 6 or something, right?
Yeah, 6.5.
Yeah. So,
but the new pension plan, clearly we have to fund the old one. But the new pension plan, one of the objectives is the city's making a contribution and is not a victim of the stock market at all going forward. So that is one of the soft landings, if you will, addressing that issue. And depending upon if we had stayed in the old plan, it would have been 90% funded within about 6 years. Right. Now it's frozen. So I believe that action that was taken indeed is positive in terms of what's been accomplished. Yeah. Thank you.
Ms. Graves.
Hi, thank you. So there's a lot of things. So if I forgot some of them, bring them back up so we can cover them. I think there's a couple of things to do with the budget. One, we've cut every year. And then people come in and say, oh, we want this, please keep it. But we've never shown people, and Mr. Purvan, I sat here through a budget, it was either last year or the year before, where you said people never make the connection what the services cost. They're always saying, we want these things, but what do they really cost? This year we've laid out what it really costs to have this and this and that. And so now people can come forward and say, that's too much. So I think we're giving people an opportunity here to see not what it costs to get rid of something, but what it costs to keep something. Now, as far as the OPEB trust, one of the things that the strategic planner talked about is when you put this money in, because we've been funding it pay as you go, but when you put this money in, what is the opportunity cost of those dollars to use for the future versus now? And I think that as the council, we looked at where we're at right now, and there's still movement to go. For example, if we can sell that Dodgertown property, we've learned to live with that debt service of $660, $670 a year. There's no reason why that can't roll over and then become debt service towards that OPEB liability. And then it's already built in. It's something that we've learned to live with and we can utilize. And as far as the recreation costs per household, I would agree with you if we only serve the residents of Vero Beach. The problem is our service area is not really well defined because we're not tracking how many people utilize our services that aren't residents of the city of Vero Beach. So we're kind of incurring a cost as good neighbors with our beaches and our parks and our festivals, because I can tell you it's not just the residents of the city utilizing these services, but we're taking those costs on in the process, and I think that really affects our budget because we're not really giving ourselves credit for the number of people we're serving in regards to the residents proper in the city.
Well, that's an argument that cuts both ways. I mean, the residents of Vero Beach go up to Sebastian and they go out county and they use those services too. The people in this town go out to the outlet mall. They go to other cities in different counties. So, I mean, you're not giving an apples to apples argument.
I'm not sure I understand what you're saying.
Well, you're saying the city of Vero Beach provides services to people who live outside Vero Beach.
Right. In fact, if you look
and
at
other cities provide those same services to people who live in Vero Beach.
So what I'm saying is, like, for example, if you look at the beach and shore, they just did a county analysis for their plan moving forward. And they looked at the number of people who visit the beaches within the city limits, and the number of people that visit those beaches outnumber county and tourists to local residents.
Okay.
So what I'm saying is we're financing things for everybody to use, and we're not charging fees. We're not saying you need to have a special tag to park in our beaches. We're not saying county residents have to pay this, county residents have to pay that. We're opening up our services for anyone who wants to use them, county residents or tourists.
So does the county up in the town of Orton.
They have a much larger budget.
They have a what?
See, I clearly understand what you're saying, and you're correct. It's a problem for the city, no doubt about it. We do have a reputation for being a great city, and it's like anything else. I mean, you get your wife living in a great neighborhood, and damn, it's going to be hard moving her backwards. And the same thing goes on in the city, no doubt about it. But the fact still is, we took an increase in the fund again this year. Mostly due to payroll, I understand that, but we do have old buildings over there we're trying to sustain, and the buildings are, and if we had an engineer go out and look at the buildings, I suspect we got a lot more money to spend on those buildings.
And I agree, because if you look at the amount of maintenance spent on these past few years, it's been nothing. I mean, we have not been taking care of these, so now all of a sudden we're hit with a very large amount of money to bring them up to just getting rid of broken windows, broken doors, leaky roofs. I mean, we're not talking about brand new buildings here. We're talking about just trying to bring them up to be useful.
And we got it on a piece of land, and Lord knows what value that piece is now. I don't know what that land's worth, but it's worth more than the darn building sitting on it, I'm sure you. But again, I'm not so much concerned about where we're going, but when we see tax increases, and I don't see a plan for the debt service, and I don't see a plan for the sustainability of our revenue. I could sit down on my computer and project out that we're flatline, and our expenses revenue are going to cross pretty darn shortly. And I think the political people have to get real firm, and our staff is doing exactly what our elected people are telling them to do. So the leadership is in the political side. Jim and his staff can do what we need to do, but they can't do it without leadership. And I'd like somebody to sit down and send me a memo. How do you think this is going to work out 5 years from now, 3 years from now?
Well, and the thing
project it out.
And the thing to remember is this is still a work in progress, and that's why we're here today. That's why we're having the Finance Commission look at it. We're still looking at it. And I believe Mr. Gore is going to be putting a presentation towards the end of this meeting. This isn't by no means, signed in blood. We still have lots of room we can work in it. And one of those conversations we have to have is which of these assets do we need to continue to use? Do we need to continue to fund? Or could someone fund it better? And these are ongoing conversations. And I think it's going to take a lot more than what can happen in this room today and just over the next few weeks. But certainly we can look at the numbers and come up with something a little bit easier to swallow. But I think that the reality is, our taxes have stayed flat for a very long time, and they're going to have to move. And I remember someone else who sat on this commission who said they'd be willing to pay more just to let another place get out of our electric service. So I don't understand why we wouldn't be willing to pay a little bit more to hopefully bring down other costs in other ways and have a sustainable way going forward.
Anything to start the snowball rolling, Ms. Graves. Okay. Anything to get rid of Vero Electric. Okay.
So. That's the point, is we all need to be here and working together, and I think that we're going to get there. It's just going to need to be a little bit more creative.
Well, you can tell from the way I talk about it, I don't think we got many line items that we can control very much. Yeah. When I look at the payroll as a percent of our total costs, it's hard, firm, and going up. And I look at how much is left to sustain everything else, it's pretty marginal. And the only item I can see in the operating statement that has any discretionary of any magnitude is sitting in our recreation program. I'm looking at you, young lady. right.
No, I know, but and the other thing is, recreation is one of those things that will never be sustainable on its own, because the purpose of it is to offer these services that usually cannot be offered other places, and especially with our summer camps and all of the. If you go to Leisure Square, the number of programs that we utilize with the number of kids who, if we charged what it costs to make money back, the kids who are using them could not use them. So in some ways, we have to look at, is that something we want to offer as a city? Because I don't think you can ever ask recreation to be sustainable, or you would knock out all the people who utilize the services.
No, I agree. It's probably totally sustainable.
No, it never can be.
But if draining funds there, we need elsewhere, and we do. The streets have been getting beat up. We need money for the streets. Buildings going to hell in a handbasket. We need money for that.
Absolutely. So you see, I mean, we're in a predicament. I mean, that's the way it is.
We are in a predicament, but it takes tough, hard decisions
right.
on behalf of the politicians. It's much easier, and I'm not being critical of you. It's every place in the political world. All the politicians are easy to increase. Ask them to decrease, and they have a hard time figuring out how to do that.
Well, and the other thing that we would really appreciate the Commission's advice on in moving forward is looking at a reserve policy and what our reserves should be. And if we are at excess of reserves, should we use a little bit of that unrestricted funds to fund these capital projects? And should those be coming out of tax dollars? So these are all things we can look at to put a little bit more sustainability in what we're doing.
I don't think
right
we have
now.
a reserve fund, do we?
Yes, we do.
Wait until I make my presentation.
We have quite a reserve fund, Mr. Stump, I think.
Yeah, I think it's
$9.4 million discretionary use in the general reserve fund, which is about 4.5 months. It's almost half a year's worth of reserve, and I'll get to that.
So I'm going to let you guys get to it, but that, we just have to look at all these different options and also talk to the city and talk to ourselves about what we need to do going forward. So thank you. I'm going to let you guys get back to it.
Thanks.
Right. I just wanted to make some points. Who are our customers and users? We have residents of Vero Beach, full-time and part-time. We have taxpayers of Vero Beach, and that's not only residents, but it's our businesses. We have our customers of utilities that are in the county and Indian River Shores. Some are water sewer only, some are electric only, and some are both. We have tourists, and then we have visitors. The county is 162,000 people. 144 full-time residents, but 162,000 during the high season. Vero Beach goes from about 15.7 to about 17.5 during the season. That gets to the issue of and with all of these customers and users, they're not all congruent, having the same priorities. Obviously, recreation being one. But my point being that we have underutilized and non-performing assets. Surplus land, for example. We have a right-of-ways, which is maybe marginal, but have to be maintained, and insurance and so forth. We have the old power plant that someday can be converted, presumably, into a either being developed or whatever utilization. We have the old post office on the corner of Indian River Boulevard and 17th, that could be a prime piece of property, to be able to monetize that. And we have Dodgertown, as mentioned, that can be monetized. In addition, we'll talk about underutilized, non-performing. We have 14 acres across from Crest Lawn Cemetery. That might be grandfathered for in adding to the cemetery, but we have that. We could consolidate city offices. The city has facilities everywhere where we have offices, and there may be a potential to go walk through this building and see how many empty. And then the recreation facilities. We have Bethel Creek, and we have other facilities which are non-performing in terms of, do we really need those facilities to be an ongoing, and all of the different programs. I know they're comprehensive, they're extensive, but are all of those in fact needed? The marina, we talked about the marina. What about a public-private arrangement that would give us at least as much, the city as much money as is being contributed now, that a private firm can come in and manage it and potentially upgrade it, and then there would be various costs, particularly in personnel and others, that wouldn't burden the city. And then Cindy's doing some optimization in customer service and IT and billing. I'm not saying they're going to come in immediately. I'm not going to say that they will require policy decision. And then there is going to be the city has 1.2 million total in utilities and streetlights annually. Then some piece of that, whatever comes out, $1.85 a month or what, to begin with. But, I'm saying going forward. Now, and we mentioned the OPB trust not being addressed. The stormwater utility was originally, as I understand it, about $1.3 million in capital investment. And if you have that capital investment for infrastructure, which still is on hold until there's some specificity on how that is going to be funded, how it's going to be run, whether it's going to be a enterprise fund, all of the above. But that is a source of keeping and improving our infrastructure. So obviously we mentioned those areas. Now, I also talked to the staff additions that are being programmed for next year, but in fact may not all be filled on October 1st. So those are the issues. And then it gets to what I mentioned, the policy for the level and use of the unrestricted general fund reserves. And Cindy, I know you have and would like to make your comments on the use of reserves.
We've had some conversation, the chairman and I, about this issue. Essentially what we have right now is about $9.4 million, which is about 45% of operating expenses and transfers as reserves. I think what I gave you, I showed you a sheet that has the history of our fund balance reserves there as one of the pieces of paper that I gave out a few minutes ago. And so you can see that, over the course of the last 5 years, we've been down as low as 7.7 million and 7.6 million, and then, built it back up to a little over 9. I would have to say that, in my opinion, I don't think 45% is too high. You look at the GFOA guidance, it says, a couple of months as a minimum, and that minimum starting point is really just for cash flow purposes. I mean, you have a couple of months where you don't get any ad valorem taxes at all, and you're kind of living on your reserves. But the mitigating factors that are laid out in many of the fund balance policies include hurricanes, the volatility of other revenue sources, et cetera. So, then this is truly a personal opinion. I don't think 45% is particularly too high, but that is truly a policy decision. My bigger concern is that if we begin to spend fund balance as a way of balancing our budget, that we do not spend one-time revenues on recurring expenses. That is critical, because all that really kind of does is kick the can down the road in a way that's unpleasant for the next group of people that has to deal with it eventually. But certainly if the appropriate level of reserves, a fund balance policy, and a fund balance policy that targets those use of reserves toward non-recurring expenditures is a conversation that I think we should have. You know, a good fund balance policy has layers. As recommended by GFOA, it has a minimum, you don't touch this amount. It has a budget stabilization layer, and in many cases, in places like ours, has a hurricane reserve layer, and certainly that's a conversation worth having. So, again, this is a policy decision. All I would encourage is that if we do begin to balance our budget with the use of fund balance, that we be very careful that we match one-time revenues and one-time expenditures and not fill the gaps for recurring expenditures with money that does not replenish itself. So,
thank you. And the issue is that in talking to Craig Dunlop, and of course with both Cindy and Jim, Craig being our city financial advisor, is that with all the caveats of the level, there is no city policy for the use of that reserve fund. It's almost half a year, 6 months fund. Now, I absolutely believe, as Cindy said, there should be a portion of that now $9.4 million that is restricted, say, for dune replacement or for infrastructure failure or for storms. But there's another piece that should be targeted for specific one-time events, major lawsuits that come across, environmental cleanup, and some soft landing for precipitous drops in budgeting. And there is a significant amount of literature on this. I have been talking to, and I've sent to the commission, which I have just gotten, what the Government Finance Officers Association recommends. And they indeed are recommending a tiered policy. And it's critical that the City Council address what a policy should be and what would be the level. Clearly, that's under their purview. I do believe that having half a year's 46% of the annual years, a portion of that could be used for several funding sources. One is $900,000 that is a debt service payment that gets defeased by 17. To pay that, which would then reduce the general fund by $640,000. And another $200,000, which is paid out of other funds, which would reduce the need for the 450 infrastructure. So that would be $800,000, and I know you can do a much better job than I can, Cindy, about. But there's $800,000. Actually, it's $900,000, $899,000, of which $200,000 is in the other than the sales tax and so forth. But that all goes for infrastructure. I would argue that the $45,000 for dune replacement should be really in a policy for a reserve fund, because it doesn't happen every year. We've gone in the last 6 years, 3 years of 0, 1 year of 8, 1 year of 45, and 1 year of 150. So, it's not a recurring event every year. The other thing is FEMA. I don't believe that FEMA, because that was a one-time hurricane event, should be paid out of operating funds. And then finally, I believe that that comes to $987,000 between the two sources, the three sources I've mentioned, and then perhaps with some review of the other project, we could perhaps squeeze another $15,000 off of the remaining transfer to capital expense that's in this year's budget, and thus reduce the 1.7 million by $1 million. And that's what my proposal is.
Let me respond a little bit here. I think it's great. We got an unrestricted fund balance of $9.4 million. As long as nobody ever looks at the $15 million in liabilities that are the other benefit pension program. As long as we never acknowledge that, we got $9.4 million. That's great. Now, that being said, Cindy, I would look at our financial, our operating statement a little differently than Mr. Chairman does here. I think our revenues are pretty consistent, and I think our expenses are pretty consistent. If you divide the expenses up in between, roughly it's going to be about $6 million in known reserves for pension payments, and that's not going to change very much if you add that all up. That's pretty consistent. So there's not a lot of viability of fluctuation in that. So netting that against the 20, that leaves us around $13 million. And within that $13 million is pretty consistent. We don't have a lot of expenses in there that aren't well known. It's all basically salary, but within 10% of it. So that being the case, I think our $9.5 million reserve is substantially more than 45% of the year. Probably doesn't need that much. But I'm not willing to spend money for deferred expenses. I would be more prone to be allocating it to added value to the city, meaning we stop fiddling around with putting paint on a barn that's dead on us, right? And we begin to think about building a new recreation center, properly built to today's environment, and get it well located. That would seem to be a value added for the longer run. So I would be more for that. I am not for piecemealing, like you said, cutting the reserve for those little things. And I don't know yet, and I have yet to anybody tell me what's going to happen. Nobody knows what the rail situation is going to be. Nobody knows how adversely it affects our downtown area. Nobody knows how much cost we might have to incur to get these streets covered. Nobody knows those costs yet. So I don't think we should be spending money until we got a little more consistently in our knowledge base. I'd like to know what the railroad is. If they're coming with 42 trains, how does it affect the downtown area? Is the building viable? Does it vibrate? Can anybody use it? There's some restaurants downtown, they're dying. They're going to die with the railroad coming on the way it does. Same thing is going on. I don't know. How it does affect City Hall. How does it affect the police department? Do we have an analysis of that? Do we have two police officers, police stations, one handling west and east now?
Go ahead.
Just to address that, the answer to the question is we have set up part of this budget represents, using police as an example, where we would have two officers virtually at any given time west of the railroad track. We have two that would be in and around the railroad track vicinity and two on the island. So that's what is contained in this budget and the proposal that the chief has put forward. But coming back to the vibrations on the building, number one, I guess we all need to stop and look. You go up into the northeast, there are a lot of businesses located near railroad tracks because they have railroad tracks that go right through the center of town.
Traveling slower, Jim.
Huh?
They're traveling slower.
Well, that is true. But what we have been told, and according to the railroad company, is that vibration is actually going to go down with the reconstruction of the track.
What's our decimal rating?
Well, the decibel is not as much of an issue because supposedly, and we have not received the plans for each one of those intersections, if it comes to an operation of a quiet zone, which the decibels would go down. But the way these trains are being designed, what we're being told, and the reconstruction of the track, the vibration would go down, and the noise from a train going, because there's only going to be like 4 or 5 cars on the trains that we're really talking about. Now, you're still going to have considerable amount of volume of the transport train. Yeah.
Right.
So you're going to have that. But again, there are a lot of places where businesses don't fold because of that. Our building, there's no question, we have actually 3 buildings there that are of concern. One is the old railroad station that we have, the other is our community center, and then the Heritage Center. If the vibration does not change or goes down, then we don't have any problems from a vibration standpoint. But going back to the Heritage or the community center as an example, that building has a considerable part of its life used. Now we go back in and we do the touch-up, and you were asking, do we do cosmetic? I think we do a little bit more than cosmetic because structurally we can't allow people to go in there unless we have addressed those issues. But you go out to Leisure Square, I mean, we let the roof and the buildings, and you go through and you see the tattered awnings that we have there. Again, this budget is to catch up on those and to replace that type of material and equipment. We've also evaluated where do we need awnings and where we don't need awnings, and should we build something structural there. But a lot of that is capital up front, which is not proposed, but we are trying to address. But in issues, again, using Leisure Square as our example, we have to do something about the roofing conditions. I mean, that's a substantial part of your structure. And we have been. This budget year, we've done a considerable amount of work, and we are going to do it. But we also have issues that come up. Example, police department. We've had 2 air conditioning systems go down at about $25,000 apiece. Plus, now we have did we ever get the elevator fixed? No. So we have elevator issues in that building. And so those are part and parcels to having older buildings that you've got to do in order to maintain the functionality of the buildings. So it is something that we do address. We address on a regular basis. We have a crew that goes in, and when you have, using recreation again, it's because some of their buildings are some of the oldest, we'll have someone from the Public Works crews go in and do repairs and replacements when are necessary. The other thing I want to point out, and I think it sometimes gets lost in our business of local government, when you say that the overextended cost that we're spending in our budget goes to labor, we are a very labor-intensive business, and that individual that's riding around in a patrol car, or that individual who is going out and cutting the grass, or that individual who's going around emptying the trash cans at the park is an element of providing the service to the residents. That person is equal to or greater in importance because not everybody goes to the community center, not everybody goes to the Heritage Center, not everybody goes to Leisure Square, not everybody goes to J.C. Park, but virtually everybody is touched by a city employee every day. Whether he's reading your meter, he's cutting the grass in front of your yard, in front of your house, or he's picking up your trash, or whatever the case may be. And so that is the highest cost that you will see in virtually any budget, because we have yet to be able to respond virtually by a police officer and satisfy a customer.
Jim, I don't disagree with you. I mean, I think the critical item in our equation is people.
Yeah.
And I'm certainly not faulting where we are on the pay of people, because I know we've had some dead years and people didn't get paid at all. Just barely got increases. So I understand all that. But again, it comes back down that we longer run have a problem. Someplace we're going to face a problem on our debt service, someplace along the line. We got to figure that out. And I do think we have to begin to look at costs that we can control and costs we can't control.
And Glenn, I agree with you, and I think we have areas that we can control cost. It's just a function of what services are we going to provide. And I think over the last 4 years, that's exactly what we've done.
I agree.
The number and the head counts have actually gone down.
Maybe you should add one word to that. What are the essential services we should be providing? And I don't think the council goes into that.
And Dan, that is also a very good question.
What does the city really need? Do we
what
really
is
need
essential?
Leisure Square? I mean, you say not everybody uses that. I'd like to know what the percentage is.
Do we need J.C. Park? J.C. Park is a function of cost. We have to go out and cut the grass, maintain the trash. I mean, is that a... And again, you're right. What
It's
is
an
essential?
assumption made that all these recreational costs are needed, you know?
And I will tell you another assumption. For the person, you don't need 2 police officers on the island. You look at the number of crimes committed.
That's right.
And so we have built to the point. But I will tell you, if you go to one of the neighborhood crime watch meetings anywhere in the community, and they will tell you we are short on police.
Right.
So essential service is one of those definitions that is really left up by policy. This budget represents what is essential service. And the question is what do you eliminate? The guy that Randy talked about that came in and gave us about doing this plan, the strategic plan. My question to him was, in what city did you close a building and get rid of the building as part of your strategic plan to eliminate that service? He could give no examples. As a matter of fact, he says, well, we did, in one city, they quit providing the service for a while, but it was reinstated. But much more efficiently, I think is the way he put it. Which is, the fact is essential services are dependent upon the people using it. And that's, you put that up for a vote, I guess would be the only way I know of to do it. And we live in a society that essential services is what affects me. If my house is broken into, the police immediately become a very essential service. And I not only want 2 officers in my neighborhood, I want 3 officers in my neighborhood. And the same goes for cutting grass. When we contracted out the mowing, and which we are now even still recovering today, you go and where people see grass growing a little higher during the rainy season, in our contracts, we're a fixed cost. That's the only way we can reduce it in our contracts of mowing the parks. And yes, during the rainy season, they get a little higher. When they were city employees, we could dispatch a crew out there and do it. And people got used to that. And is that an essential level of service? And the answer is probably no, because I don't use those parks. But for the people who use the park, it becomes.
I think we're a city of 15,000 people, and we're trying to support a lot of things. And I think it gets down to what Ms. Graves says. We need to know who of our city residents are using these facilities, because we should not be paying for everyone else to use it if we're not using them ourselves, because as long as you have the beach in low density, Vero is Vero, and people, we just shouldn't have to be supporting, as small a group as we are, the recreation and the services for other people.
Catherine, I have to agree with Dan on that. Part of the quality of life that you have, there are people, myself included, that will go to Sebastian every so often. Now, I don't use their parks as much as I use our parks, but and that is the cross dynamics of being in a community and really being a community-oriented business. The question that I think we need to ask is, take out all of who uses it and who doesn't use it, is what is the community? What are the services that the community actually wants? And unfortunately for us, we don't have a service that hasn't been asked for by somebody in the community.
Well, you're saying there are multiple services, and each service has some small contingent who is very enthusiastic about it.
Absolutely.
But overall, it's a very small group.
If you just walk out to the dog park, a very valuable piece of land, somebody was talking about the value of land, and make the head count of how many Vero Beach residents and how many people from outside. But you would not have a facility that looks that nice without the people from the outside using it. If you don't get the numbers up, you don't do it. But it is a cost, and this is one of those cost of capital issues. It's sitting on a very valuable piece of ground that the city invested in, and it's determined to be an essential service or we wouldn't have it. But it is the cost of opportunity of that property if you look at it from that perspective.
But two, I think, fees for some of these services are justified. Yeah.
And they are justified. I mean, coming back to essential services, police, in my opinion, is a fundamental basic service of a city.
No question.
And so you've got to have some level of that. Now, do you need 52 police officers or you need 12 police officers? That, again, is a service level. But I dare say that if you closed up our parks, just use our beach parks, that takes away from an entire frontage that promotes commercialization, i.e. the hotels and the restaurants. And so we provide a quality of life that hopefully helps other opportunities take place in our community. And I guess that's what we're saying, is it becomes a quality of life issue. The Leisure Square, how many people use Leisure Square? There's quite a few people that come and go through Leisure Square. I mean, and it's a varied head count of demographics. We have senior swimming and we have youth swimming. But we have lifeguards and we have a pool that we're going to have to gunite this year. That's going to be an expense. And
a lot of services can be provided by commercial enterprises that then create businesses.
Oh, and there's no question.
Jim, why
not
can't,
in the public sector, but in the private sector.
To supplement Kay's point, why can't the users of Leisure Square go out and buy a gym card like I do? Planet Fitness.
And
now, maybe there's more to Leisure Square than what I know of or think of, but $10 a month is all we're talking about to Planet Fitness. And there's a lot of gyms. I just mentioned that because I go there.
No commercials, please.
No commercials. I'm not a
Let's take one activity that we put on there that's nowhere else that you would have to, I don't know how they would function, and that's the dance routine thing that we do for youth. And again, does it pay for itself in cash? Probably not. As a quality of life, possibly. But yes, if you close down Leisure Square today, the effect on the community would be very, very minimal from a operation of a city. But does the Leisure Square add to a quality of life for a segment of our community? And that's the question you have to ask. And
where I'm going, where I'm driving at is, at some point in some area of the budget, you've got to say no to the people at large. We can't do everything that you want done. Mr. Old made a point, is we can't pay off all these debts right now. Maybe you were referring to OPED, or maybe it was something else. He said, we can't do it. Well, if we can't do that, then we can't afford to say yes to everybody in this city who wants this special thing, that special thing. We can't be all things to all people.
We are paying off. Let's don't lose sight.
Well,
we have one of the lowest tax rates in the entire state of Florida, and we're paying as you go, and we're paying that off. We even changed our pension plan that in 10 years, that unfunded liability really goes away. And 10 years in the city business is a relatively short period of time. The OPEB is something that we have to do, but the fact of the matter is we're paying those premiums every year. And we have been paying those premiums. We have not missed one payment in the history of the city in doing it. And, we just don't want to get to the point where we're scaring people with big numbers. I do appreciate the fact that we're sitting here talking about how we have an accumulation of cash. Now we want to go spend it. I mean, that's, to me, makes me feel very good that we, from a city's perspective, we're in great financial shape because we are now saying that we're going to spend money that we have in reserve because 40 days or 45 days or whatever the number is that we're doing. 120 days. Or 45% is too
45%.
much.
45%.
I don't want to spend it, but why not treat it like an endowment fund? Figure out what that $9 million earns every year. I have no idea. But then use that for debt retirement. That would be a starting point.
And just to clarify a couple of numbers, because you made a couple of points I wanted to come back to if we're going to have this conversation. You're absolutely right that there's two kinds of balances on our books. There's our absolute cash balance, our 9.4 unrestricted. That's our real balance. But on the general government financial statements, when you accumulate all that up and you add that $15 million of OPEB liability to it, we actually have at this point a minus $4 million unrestricted net assets in our governmental funds, and any depletion of that fund balance will make that negative number bigger. In other words, that $9 million offsets that $15 million, leaving you a minus $4 on the government-wide financial statements. We have $9.4 million in cash. Right. But when you book that liability against it, that's what you end up with. So as that number gets smaller, that deficit gets bigger. You make a good point. Second, and one of the GFOA recommendations is to consider the absolute fund balance in the context of the government-wide balance. The second thing is it is 45%. It is 45% of our expenditures and transfers, which are really part of our expenditures. So let's not get, the number is 45%, which is a little over 5 months. And the third thing I wanted to make sure we're clear on is that the debt service, the 2012B, that $900,000 is not a one-time expense. There's 2 years of that debt service that needs to be paid, both 15, 16, and then the last payment in 16, 17 before it actually is retired. So as we're moving forward with this conversation, I just want to make sure we have all the facts and the right numbers in front of us.
The other thing and a comment I want to make, again, very proud of the fact that we're talking about spending reserves because we think we have too much money. But the second thing that I want to be able to comment on is that we have been able to do that through the diligence and the policies that the council has placed in there, which were painful over a period of time. But we did that. And the fact is, as you're sitting here making these decisions, it's not based on that it's a catastrophic decision that we have to dip into our fund balance. I'm hoping the public understands this is totally a discretionary decision by the policymakers of the city, and it's not that we're going bankrupt and that we have to dip into our reserves, because at a 2.033 property tax, ad valorem tax rate, we're pretty substantial. So we've been able to accumulate as well as keep property tax relatively low.
I'd like to make a point as well. By the end of this year, the various bonds that we have that you've handed out, debt, will be down to $8.5 million. By 2017, it'll be down to $6.5 million. If and when the properties can be monetized, that whatever you can sell Dodgertown or the diesel plant or the property on the old post office would drive those debts down to zero. So just make that point. If Dodgertown was not purchased.
And it is the golf course part, just so the public understands, we're not talking about selling the baseball field.
No.
Talking about essential services.
My point is that if Dodgertown 9-hole golf course wasn't purchased, we would have zero debt in the city. And we're on a trajectory now. As I said, within the next, by 2017, we will have paid off $3 million in debt. Hence, why I was where I'm coming from. But I see Mr. Much is there, and come on, Mark.
Mark Chair, 617 Indian Lilac Road. Since I've been standing there, I came up with about 10 more things. But the one thing that I wanted to comment on, and I don't want anybody to get me wrong, I don't have any problem with employees getting raises from time to time at reasonable levels. I wish they were more, I wish there was a merit component associated with those raises as opposed to just the ability to keep breathing another year. But during the budget hearings, I heard someone report that the employees hadn't gotten any raise, no employee had gotten any raises for like 8 years. Well, that's kind of a no-brainer for the city council to say, well, if that's the case, we ought to give everybody a raise of at least 3%. But my memory isn't very good, but it seems to me that isn't the case, and I just want to get up here and have that situation straightened out. Haven't employees gotten raises in the recent past?
There've been some raises given out, not to
But
3%.
not
They've been
materially.
raises.
We gave 3%
Right.
2 years ago, I believe
Okay,
it was.
darn right.
Yeah.
And I think that exceeds the average salary increase in the private sector. From what I'm hearing and what I'm reading, not that I'm all inclusive, private sector hasn't been averaging 3%.
Nor has Social Security increases for.
Right.
But my point is that the Finance Commission was asked to investigate. We have three choices to reduce taxes. One is to cut services. We've had a very healthy discussion in terms of trying to assess which are essential, which are not essential, which might be outsourced, Catherine. But if one had a strategic plan, one would have some of those issues. So one thing is assuming that the vast majority of what we have in the budget is, at this point in time, essential. Secondly, so if you're not, but you can cut services to reduce taxes, secondly, we can use the reserve to cut taxes,
Or at least the interest on it.
Yeah.
And you did raise a point I wanted to address. Those reserve funds,
Yes.
By Florida statutes, are invested in things like federal government instrumentalities and bonds and things like that.
Okay.
So the return is not
2%
very
minimum.
great.
2%.
Less at this point. It's getting better. It's been a little over 1,
Well.
but it's required by Florida statutes that we put liquidity and safety first and earnings very last. So those monies as a trust fund, I mean, that's a great idea. The amount they're earning actually does go into the general fund, and we're getting up around $100,000 a year. So it's just not great. But you make a good point. I forgot what my other point was going to be, so I'll just. Oh, I just wanted to clarify, as Jim did on something earlier, we're not talking about using reserves for a tax decrease. We're talking about using reserves to mitigate the proposed tax increase. So I don't, in other words, the $1.7 million was the not to exceed millage, increase. And what you're trying to do is find ways to lower that to, if possible, zero. I don't want to get anyone the impression that we're talking about a decrease from where we sat last year and further down. So.
Again, though, if we're talking about using it for capital items, then it really should be capital items, not just painting.
And actually,
there has to be a difference between how we use it.
If you look at page 107 of this budget, you'll see the capital items that it's because I know someone brought that up. That's the actual list of capital that's funded in part by the 450, in part by 1 cent sales tax, and some other revenue sources. If you're interested in what kinds of capital projects are being programmed,
That's very detailed. I saw it. Yeah. Mr. Chairman, can I ask a couple questions?
Absolutely.
Cindy, when we talk about the electric operation, just looking at the budget next year, on our revenue side, we're down about $2 million on the revenue side, and it's all pretty much in the commercial sales. I mean, how does commercial sales go down by $2.7 million? I mean, what's causing that?
I will tell you, and this is an answer. Actually, we had this conversation at the budget workshop. Mm-hmm. Last year's budget was based on my for sales and revenue forecasting model, and was designed to cover expenses with information that we had from FMPA at that point in time in like May, June. Mm-hmm. And essentially, last year's budget was out the window in probably 10 minutes after October 1st because we actually got real numbers on revenues, expenses, we had rates set, et cetera. So what you have is that last year's budget, which really didn't bear a lot of resemblance even to the first quarter 14-15 rate sufficiency in terms of revenue, compared to a budget that was prepared for the revenue side by PRMG, with their much more sophisticated rate model. So although, as they indicated to you when they came and gave their preliminary rate study, we were covering expenses with revenues at the bottom line, the mix of costs and the mix of revenues was a little bit different than my projection than my relatively unsophisticated rate projection sheet. So essentially, it's not that commercial revenues are down, it's that you're comparing apples and oranges by comparing last year's budget and my model and the information I had last May to the much more sophisticated model and budgeting, et cetera, and better information that we have from PRMG this year. It just looks like they're down, but they're not really.
Well, I mean, it's all positive.
You'd be better off.
We end up with more surplus this year on lower revenue.
You'd really be better off comparing, honestly. Take your third quarter rate sufficiency that I gave you and the revenue projections for that third quarter rate sufficiency in terms of the revenue from the various sources and compare that to next year's baseline budget. You'd be much better off. And if you do that, you're going to see a comparison of 46 in residential with 46.7 for next year, 41.5 is the third quarter rate sufficiency for commercial versus 41.2 for next year. So I mean, really these numbers here are much closer to are a better point of comparison. Yeah. Unfortunately, the way this is set up, I can't do anything about the 2014-15 adopted budget is what it is, but this is really a better point of comparison to next year than,
Let me ask you another couple questions on our, again, within electric operation. I noticed that a couple others with the state FEMA repayment that we had this year. We got $250,000 in the electric operation. Now, is that done this year, or is that
This is the end.
What?
Yeah.
Just a 1 year?
It's been about a year and a half.
Yeah, so it's going to be over.
It's going to be over this year, this coming year.
I noticed in another fund, general fund had about 40,000, and
right.
I think sewer and floor has got maybe 300,000.
Yeah.
So I guess it was upwards of 500,000 or something like that.
Oh, it was almost $2 million across all the funds.
Was it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's the deal where we're repaying it because we have to. Because if we don't, they're going to hold our next hurricane funds, and then if we win our appeal, we'll get the money back. But in the meantime, it's going out. So.
And then when I ran through the marina, again, a little strange, maybe just funny money, I don't know. But the revenue's down. You go over and you look at his oil and gas, right? Mm-hmm. And oil and gas is down by $138,000, right? On his expense side, his revenue's down by $90,000. I mean,
that's purely about fuel prices. His revenues and his expenses that he budgeted last year, he's actually running the right margin in the actuals, but prices are lower than he projected. So that's
his margins are holding up.
His margins are holding up. Yeah. Yeah.
Because in this operation, he shifted. His reserve has gone down by 112,000 again this year on an operating statement basis. Mm-hmm. He's gone from 228 to 116.
Yeah, and what he's proposing to do...
It seems a little strange.
Well, what he's proposing to do, just so you know, we had a fairly extensive conversation about this at the budget workshop, too. If you take away the debt service that the marina is paying and just look at his operation without that debt service, he's doing fairly well. He's covering costs. He's making a contribution to the general fund.
His debt service has been pretty consistent year to year.
About $300,000 a year, and it's going to go on for quite some time. So what he's proposing to do is the budget, as you see it, actually is a deficit of about $13,000. What council gave him approval to do was to increase his rates, which he hasn't done for a number of years at the marina. So the version of the budget that's going to come to the first council's first public hearing will have that increased revenue from the increase in rates that Tim is proposing, and I think he's actually putting it on an upcoming agenda.
That one just...
He knows he needs to raise rates to cover costs a little better.
Go ahead.
And my point is, we just briefly mentioned potentially a public-private arrangement for the marina. Bottom line is the marina contributes $100,000 in transfers. And the crossover would be, could there be an alternative that could improve the marina and at least get $100,000 back? And again, that would be a strategic planning.
And payment of the debt service.
Yeah.
And payment of the debt service. I mean, that's something that's not necessarily part of the operation. The rent that we get from that building is not comparable to the debt service. So
it's an old developer. I think it's throwing off about $450,000. Debt service is $3,000. Pocket is $150,000. Not bad.
No,
depending on our leverage factor.
We don't get that much rent for that property.
So.
Yeah. But again, we can't. That's a property that we can't sell. because of the nature of the funds that we got for buying it in the first place. We got a find grant, and once you've taken the find grant for that, you can't just sell it. It's deed restricted. So.
And I know we're still in the planning stage of the stormwater utility, but we got it budgeted for $1.6 million next year. But I don't see any expenses, so I guess it's all coming out of the sewer other operation. Apparently, we must have enough staff to do that.
The expenses are in here.
Well, it may be buried in the
page
big
206.
figures.
Page 206.
What?
Page 206.
Yeah, but
it shows vehicles, and then BMP implementation, and then actually there's details, descriptions of the projects in the 5-year book.
But I suspect the staff that's doing this is already in another division.
Oh yes, they're actually in the general fund, but at this point, part of what we do is we actually charge out to the capital projects funds for our engineers' time.
That's what I'm saying. Part of that $500,000 is staff.
Right. If you go over and look at the streets and engineering, or streets and paving and the engineering divisions, you'll see interfund transfers of. In other words, if they do design, they'll charge other funds. Yeah.
I'm about to quit too. But the other thing I noticed, Cindy, I don't understand these things. When I looked at the cemetery fund, right, I mean, if you subtract out the management fees, the GF fees, I mean, year to year, it's $167,000. Last year it was $167,000. So it just looks like arbitrarily the management fees, GF fees, went up.
That is a function of what we were talking about with risk management. Okay, first of all...
Oh, the risk management is in that figure too, huh?
Any charges back from the general fund to the cemetery would include any of the risk management and HR funds. So yeah, that's a function of every fund getting away for a few years with not making any contributions to the risk management fund. Now they have to pay their fair share of that particular function within the general fund. If you look back 3-4 budget years ago, you'll see transfers to the risk management fund that this replaced. And again, we've looked at that general fund admin charge. That's everything. I mean, the clerk's time for selling sites and keeping track of all that. I mean, they spend a tremendous amount of time on cemetery customers. That includes, everything: payroll, cash related, legal, counsel, everything. So, I mean, that's a fairly
just looking like a high figure.
Yeah.
Just relative to the revenue side of the deal.
Yeah.
So it looks like. Right.
We are working on some repricing, I think, and just some other attempts to reprice the columbarium so that perhaps it's a little more attractive and we can generate a little more revenue. But
I would like to come back because I know Catherine has to leave shortly.
Yeah.
And make a recommendation that that we use the reserve funds to pay the debt service on the $900,000, that we eliminate $45,000 for the dunes, $41,000 or $42,000 for FEMA, and reduce the remaining $450 that was in capital by $20,000 selectively to reduce the general fund budget by $1 million, and hence cut the proposed tax increase by essentially a little more than half.
And if I could clarify before you go there on the vote, that paying the debt service, the 2012 B debt service, I believe it is, out of the general fund, understood. We can't not pay FEMA, so are you proposing that we take that out of reserves as well? In other words, we can't eliminate the FEMA payment.
Oh, no, that's what I'm saying. The same way you eliminate the dunes, but you pay the FEMA out of...
the argument, just trying to understand the motion, and then take the dunes out of the budget entirely and just pay for it if it happens.
Yes.
So actually eliminate the dunes restoration from the budget.
Right.
And then
just reduce the amount of the millage increase
by half.
Okay, so what would the millage rate be then?
It would be half of the. Hang on a second. It would be half of the increase.
To add one thing to that, if we can do it.
would be an increase of 0.3050, which would make the millage rate 2.3086.
Okay,
Something in that
let me ask you
neighborhood.
this question. In regard to that reduced increase millage rate, can we put a one-year sunset on that so it's only increased for 1 year? Can we do that with a millage?
No. Each millage rate, each budget is adopted on its own that year. Let's be really clear that no
Okay.
council can adopt a future year millage rate for good or for bad. Each year's adoption of the budget and the millage rate is a standalone individual decision per state law. So they can give direction and intention for next year, but they can't bind a future council on the adoption of the millage rate in any direction.
Yeah, every budget reflects the 5 council members and their policy decision for that fiscal year.
Because Catherine has to leave, I was wondering if I could get a second on my motion.
I'll second that.
Excuse me,
Discussion.
before, what
Of
would
course.
be left in the reserves after this?
8.4 million, or about over 4 months of about 40% of the 20 million, 21 million, which is 40% of the year, or what's that, 4.8 months of reserve?
Remember, if the budget goes up, that is not if the budget actually goes up to the 22 million, it's 8.4 divided by the 22.
Yeah, but
So
I'm recommending that you take $1 million out of the 22.
you're not taking $1 million out. You're paying for it with reserves. It's still an expense.
Yeah,
You're
well,
leaving the expenses in, but you're not funding them completely with revenue. You're having unrated surplus, so they're still an expense. I mean, the debt service is still an expense. The FEMA is still an expense. So they're part of the revenues and transfers. So it comes to about 37% after you're done,
Go ahead.
from 45 to 37%.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but the reality is I can't support that when we're sitting there with a $15 million liability, and there's nobody has even spoke about how we're going to handle it. You just want to ignore it for another couple of years? I mean, how do we do nothing?
You'd rather pay the full millage increase?
I mean, the reality is,
Glenn,
this city council has adopted a budget,
All right.
and
I agree. It's a very dangerous budget. It's not wise, but we can make it less worse with Peter's motion. If we have the full, just a minute, Glenn, I'll listen to
you. Can't get my vote for it, Dan.
If we have the full millage increase that they want, that's not going to go for debt reduction or OPEB liability. It's going to.
No, but it puts the burden where it ought to be, and it's on the city council. This is a political question, and the reality is what we're doing is we're paying for expenses out of reserves in the past. Now, I've said I'll support money to be used out of the reserve, but not for what I perceive as sort of cosmetic work going on in our buildings.
Whoa.
Particularly when we're not, I don't see where our long-term plans are.
Well, let me just say that what this money is going for is for infrastructure. That's what.
450,000 of the $1.7 million is going for infrastructure.
And the balance of, as I said, the reduction of the payments.
Peter, let me ask you a question. When you look at the $450,000 that's being spent, is it really expenses or is it capital? What are we extending the life of the building by 2 or 3 years, Peter? I don't know, Pete. No.
The 450, and because it gets, what you're doing is you're freeing up an R&R fund of monies that you can use. It's the sales tax that funds 200,000 of it, and that sales tax then can be used for the infrastructure improvements.
I know I understand what you're doing, but in one way or the other, you're shifting money from currently paying as we're going versus where we are in the capital structure. Cindy just sat there and told you she thought we were pretty conservative at having the cash reserve we have. And I said, we've got a $15 million liability offsetting. Even if you discount that down to $3 million, there is a $3 million hit to the $9 million someplace.
And
you don't want to account for it all.
As soon as we sell some of we'll get our total debt down to zero. And it's going to be down to 6.5.
But in the meantime, it's going to be down to 6.5. In the meantime, our liability for the OPEC is going up by 2.5 million a year.
Yeah.
Well, you're 6 down and 5 up. You're not getting that.
What happens is when the money that's going to be released, and you can't count on it, from the sale of Dodgertown, is going to be several $1 million. That will go into interest.
That's not a plan. That's a hope.
Well, at some point.
Well,
I said you can't bank on it.
I'm going to call the question.
With this reserve being cash, right?
Yes.
This unrestricted is for cash. If we had an emergency, do we have any kind of access to a line of credit or something where the city could have access to cash? And
We do not have a line of credit in place at this point because we have, $9 million in.
And like during the hurricane,
Fund
does
balance.
anyone have an idea of how much ready cash we needed to?
That it so
handle
depends
it?
on the hurricane. It really does. The FEMA money generally starts to flow after a while. Your real cash needs are in those initial days when you're trying to get roads cleared and things replaced. But I don't think this area has ever experienced a real hurricane on the nature of an Andrew making landfall in Homestead. So it's just so dependent on.
If it's an
on the
unrestricted
hurricane.
fund, though, couldn't we have access to it for hurricane?
Well, that's
You can have access to your unrestricted cash.
Pardon me?
The question was, do we have a line of credit with a bank in place to supplement that? And the answer was no, we do not.
Well, and we do have secondary backups, as you're saying, Catherine, because you can, the city can go out and get a line of credit to back up whatever other emergent issues come up.
Cindy, do we have any rough estimate of what our share of fixing all these rail tracks would be? Do we know yet? Any ballpark figure?
Do you have a number?
$500,000 a track?
The answer is we don't really know. We do know that they're going to pick up the great majority of it, but Glenn, we don't have a real feel for what our number will be. It's our understanding they're going to cover 100% of the cost initially. Then the annual expense we don't really have a handle on until we see exactly what they're doing.
But haven't I heard figures out there that there's a potential $3 million hit just to fix the track?
Well, and I think that was over time. The county had some projection and some numbers that they had done. I can't remember what those were, but they obviously have more crossings than we do. But it is.
But even if we discount that down half, we still could potentially have a liability there of $1.5 million to $2 million over the next 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, the exposure, what we're doing is that we're trying to build ourselves an insurance policy. In essence, is what you're doing.
Right.
And then how much of an insurance policy do you need? It's like insuring your house. In your mind, it may be worth $500,000. In the insurance company's mind, it may be worth $200,000.
Right.
And so, and that's where you're placing yourself, is to determine what is that. And as Peter said, we go through a couple of years without doing anything on the dunes. But then that one year we had $153,000. You don't have an option. Are you going to do the dunes or not do the dunes?
Right.
Because it, most of the time, affects a boardwalk and in some cases a street. So you got issues there that you've got to take care of. Again, those are the types of items that it's very hard to speculate. You could base it on last year and get the number down real far if you wanted to. So. But
Will this cause us to have an unbalanced budget and a decrease in our fund balance on the financial statements for the year? Will it show them?
Yes, what we're proposing to do, if I understand this, and I'm sorry, I just took a minute to lay the numbers out so I understand the chairman's motion, is what we would do is it would actually decrease the fund balance and show an unappropriated deficit, if you will, of $1 million and some change for the fiscal year. So yes, it will show our fund balance going down in one fiscal year from the 9.4 to the 8.4.
Is that seen as significant to the our bond underwriters? And
again, one of the things that they look at is declining fund balances, but there is no hard and fast answer to this one. I'm extremely conservative. I think I prefaced my remarks with I don't think 45% is too much. Certainly, a lot of it will depend on I think two things, and I've had this conversation with some of our advisors. The first one is whether this is a one-time event or something that's continuous, which goes back to the idea that you really shouldn't be budgeting this for recurring expenses, because then it does have a tendency to keep going. And second, a request that I would like to make of the Commission once you're done with this vote, that if we do this on September the 3rd, or if your recommendation to the Council is to do this, that we also set ourselves the goal that before we get to next budget season, we review and adopt a policy so that we don't continue to do this in future years without some sort of parameters that we've had the chance to thoroughly vet and discuss. So I'd like to see us take that on as a task, no matter what your recommendation is.
Just remember, though, that on our balance sheet, the way that shows up, it's going to show up as a negative balance sheet when he applies the cash against our OPP liability. Last time it did, it was like $4 million negative. And this year, I suspect will be about $18 million. We're about 15.5 now. Add 2.5, we're about 18 million. Less than 9, that means we're 9 negative. Less $1 million more, we're 10 negative on the balance sheet, roughly.
I could see it going up by about 3.
But I figure it's going to go up by 2.5 million.
It's going to go up by 2.5, and then the negative would go up by whatever we deplete the fund balance by.
So that takes us up to the 19 less 9.
2 points. One is to restate what Cindy did, because you've got two very conservative people sitting here running the money. So that's sort of the nature of Cindy and I and the way we do things. And the second thing that we need to do is to make sure we're doing this as discretionary. We're not out of any purpose that the world is coming to an end. We're doing this because we think we're going to establish a reserve policy that this will fall within that guideline. Because, the last thing you want to do is send somebody a message that we're depleting our reserves because we can't afford to run the day-to-day, because at the end of the day, deficit spending is deficit spending, and you're not raising that revenue in this current year. So I just want to make sure the record is very clear. What we're saying as a community is that our reserve balance is going to be, by policy, hopefully within the next few months, declared, and that we will no longer, avoid that, and we will do our budgeting according to that. That means when we set out a city budget, and let's say that we set 40% as our reserve, that'll be the target we have. Some years we may have to fund into that fund balance. Other years we'll make sure that we don't have too much in reserve.
As Cindy said, when you structure this, you structured it in tiers that some is absolutely restricted for such things as dune replacement or hurricanes. And then there's others which is discretionary in terms of soft landing for some other issues that come up, like liability suits or ecological, environmental cleanup and that kind of thing. But that policy absolutely must be set in terms of going forward. As I said, going back to, we were tasked to take a look at an option to reduce the 1.7 mil increase. And
we'll be sitting here next year.
Is that $117 per thousand of value, or 11? How does it translate?
Well,
to your tax bill.
The tax bill, the $1.7 million translated to 0.61 mils, which is $60 per $100,000 of value.
60.
Yeah.
So if you cut that down by 2/3, essentially, Or looking at it the other way again, running some numbers, if you took the $1.7 million and reduced it by the slightly over $1 million that you're proposing in this motion, if everything else stayed the same, the tax increase would be just about $700,000, just about 0.3084 mils, and your new tax rate would be around 2.335, 2.336, something like that. So you'd be looking at $30.80 per 100,000.
Mr. Chairman, I call the question. Made a motion, I seconded. We had a debate, I call it.
All in favor?
No.
Aye, I'm in favor.
All right. What's the vote down there at the end?
Passes 3-1.
Okay.
What's that?
Motion passed 3-1.
Yeah.
No, I respect all of the comments and issues. Thank you, Kevin. That we're going through. I realize that there are the issues, as you mentioned. The OPEB is critical. The balance sheet is, and the whole stormwater. And one of the questions I had is, that's another $1.5 million in capital. On top of our capital program of $7 million. So with all of that, with no increase in the public works staff. So how are you going to install, maintain, engineer, supervise that difference? And that's just a question that you were getting at. It's great to be able to purchase $1.5 million worth of baffle boxes and the concrete and whatever, but someone has to put it in. It's not all going to be contracted out. But I mean, that has to be the whole stormwater issue or utility has to be, and that in fact, Glenn, is part of the infrastructure improvement. So, but we don't.
We just have a difference of opinion.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, I know.
The difference of opinion is I feel strongly that our elected officials are on the front line of this deal. And at some point, as you said and Dan said, they've got to learn to say no. I mean, unless somebody can help us generate revenue, they can't continue to say yes. This is probably one step down the road, and we'll be doing it again. Because if we don't figure out the revenue side of this deal, and Dan, you're the guy that's beating my brains in, and
not really.
And here you're giving up.
No. I would just like to add to that. I like to go to a public workshop meeting on budget, where I see the council members say,
They do. Dan,
just a
they do
minute, I'm slow today. I'm slow.
They do a good job on the budget.
They do, and it's not easy. I'll be the first one to say it's a tough job. But I'd like to see a workshop meeting where each council member says, "This is where we cut. This is where," and each one of our departments. I'm not hearing that. I'm hearing this is what we got to spend money on. This is a new program. We got to spend. That's what I'm hearing, Glenn.
And in fairness,
No, I didn't attend all three of them, but the
I've
ones
been
I
on,
attended,
I've been
I did.
watching it pretty regularly for 3 years now, and they've done a good job of cutting expenses. And it is true. And you subtract out all the payroll, and look at what's left for them to spend for paper bill and guns, and it's pretty small. Really, it's pretty small. So they really do have an expense side problem. So then the only other thing to do is look at the revenue side and say, okay, can we drive up revenue any place? And as all of us admit, we're locked into a city size. We're locked into a geographic. We can't change very much. So if you can't sit here and forecast, a 6% revenue increase coming from organic cash flow, then the sustainability of the salaries is going to be a problem. And it gets more problem because we add payroll and we don't face up to the problem of our past expenses. And then Social Security's there. And we're rapidly getting there. Because if you do this increase this year, do another one next year, do another one the following year, it won't work. I can guarantee the expense will outrun our
I
revenue.
agree. There has to be I agree, Glenn, but
Okay.
it's not up. It's not up to us.
No,
to do
I
it.
think Peter's right. There are some assets we could capitalize. We probably do have a couple $1 million for the property in the post office. I would suspect that's a very viable piece of property, no doubt about it. We got a valuable asset. The railroad track, until we know what the railroad's going to do, I think that's a white elephant just sitting over there, you know. And we got it in litigation anyway, probably tied up for a couple more years, right? Right. So that's a white elephant. It's not going to generate much. I mean, if we were lucky and got $500,000 out of it, we'd be doing well, you know. And particularly if we're adversely affected by rail lines on the city, in the downtown part of the city. Now, maybe you could sell Dodgertown land. I don't know how many acres we got out there, Pete. 50?
We could sell it if there's a demand to buy.
But again, you're talking. But keep in mind, keep in mind that you're talking about one-time revenues that are not going to do you any good with recurring expenditures. That's what you've got to match the two things in your head. Now, if you sold it and you actually paid off debt principal and reduced your debt service stream, now you've created recurring revenue. Okay,
right.
But
you got to use it properly.
You got to use it properly, or else you've just taken one-time money, applied it a recurring problem, and that's where you've got to get the connection.
Well, presumably, if someone buys it, they're going to put some property on it. It's going to eliminate maintenance, and it's going to provide, a minimal impact in taxes and so forth. And maybe the people will also buy stuff and buy gas in the city.
But she's right. I mean, if we could sell it for $7 million, $7 million pays the debt off, right?
By the time we get to 2 years from now, the only debt we'll have left is $5 on that property on the Dodgertown golf course.
It's true. We have some assets we could capitalize on and monetize.
No, again, it gets back to without a policy.
You have to have a policy.
It's critical, and Cindy said she's working on looking at how we can get some marginal increase. It's not going to answer your question though, but on the investment, because the investment return on that 9.4 million some other bond is very, very low. Right,
and very restricted by Florida statutes. But again, you need to understand, idle cash under Florida statutes is restricted on purpose. You are not allowed to speculate, make long-term investments. We're required by Florida statutes to invest in only certain kinds of instruments, and more importantly, to emphasize safety, liquidity, and our investment horizon on those idle cash funds is 3 to 5 years. I mean, it's just, it's not the same as pension funds where you have that 20-year horizon and you can go out and invest in a totally different way. So our hands are a bit tied on that cash, just so you know. Now, I'm working with our investment advisor to do the best we can within the the confines of the statutes, but it's never going to be great. It's never going to be 5 or 6 or 7. Well, unless T-bills and federal government instrumentalities get back to that rate. So it probably has a better perspective.
I guess we're going to adjourn.
Call for adjournment.
Call for adjournment. Yeah, I have a second.
No argument. That's a nice cap you have. Is that a KFC cap?
No, this is the old Negro League, Kansas City Monarchs.
You're a fan of them. Good for you, Peter.
Well, actually,